Hey guys, Coach Ross here. Welcome to another episode of Better Body Radio. Today is episode number 38. So today I want to talk about something that often maybe isn't touched on quite as much as all the strategies around losing body fat, maintaining that calorie deficit, managing that calorie deficit, things like hunger and energy and cravings. I'm actually going to take you guys to the kind of opposite end of the spectrum. And we're going to kind of look at strategies for implementing higher calorie intakes. So when would you look at doing this? Well, generally speaking, it's not when you're going to be wanting to lose body fat. Ideally, you're going to implement higher calories when you've either been at maintenance for a stage. Maybe your maintenance intake is actually quite high, depending on your size, your goals, your activity levels, etc. Or potentially you're going to be wanting to push yourself into a slight surplus or a progressive surplus over time. And this is generally when people are kind of out of the fat loss phase. They've maybe been through dieting, they've reverse dieted up. There are certain situations in reverse dieting where you may look at some of these tactics as well, but for the most part, it's maintaining a lot of those habits and behaviors that you've had throughout your fat loss phase, whilst building in a bit more flexibility and also building in a little bit more calorie density as well. But we'll get into some of that a little bit later on. So in terms of when you look at doing this, most of the time you've been at maintenance for a period of time. You've kind of made sure that you've ingrained those good maintenance habits and routines around food, and you've built back in a little bit of flexibility, of course, into your diet as well in terms of foods that you enjoy. Some maybe foods that are a little bit more calorie dense, which we'll touch on. But say, for example, we are going to be a bit of a calorie surplus now. I will give you an example of my own. I am sitting at the moment, probably this is the third cycle of fortitude training that I'm running at the moment. And as I get to the end of that cycle, or as I'm kind of going through, the start of the cycle now, my coach and I, Callum, we'd been through a tidy up phase over lockdown, and we've been progressively over the last 4 or 5 months, kind of really pushing calories up. And I'm now at a point where maybe when I finished up my tidy up phase, I was down kind of around 2,000, 2,200 on average. I'm now on training days on 3,500 calories. What that kind of looks like roughly is 240 grams of protein, 60 grams of fats, and 500 grams of carbs. And for some of you, you might be like, oh, that sounds like a lot. And for some of you might not even think that sounds a lot, but it's all relative, right? So, in order to get that in, that's not going to go in through, chicken, boiled chicken, rice and broccoli, or sweet potato and broccoli. We're going to have to get a little bit more calorie density in there, right? And so for me to get that in, and then on non-training days, I have 240 grams protein, 100 grams fat, 300 grams carbs, and that's just over 3,000 calories. I think it's like 3,080 or something. That's also not a small amount of food. So there's a couple of things that we just have to bear in mind with that, but we'll get into that in terms of when we talk about setting up the structure framework of a higher calorie intake. But you can just see there that, to get that amount of calories in, I have to be very mindful of my meals. I have to be very, very organized in terms of preparing that much food, knowing what times I'm going to eat. Missing a meal is really not an option at that stage. If you miss a meal, it just starts to become a bit of a burden digestively, but also just becomes very laborious trying to get the food in. Ideally, what will happen is that once I come away from this end, and it may even push up closer towards 4,000, who knows, we'll see what Callum has in store for me. And some of these strategies, the more your calories start going up past what maybe your dieting calories were, or even if the further you go past what was your original maintenance, these strategies become even more important. Now, if I give you an example of one of my clients, because it's easy for me to talk about us, people think, coaches, you guys are different. But the reality is it doesn't really change. The principles don't change for our Gen Pop clients either. So if I had to take one of my clients, for example, Marina, when we got her up to the peak of our last, fat building phase, which was over a 12-week period, she started off at around about 2,000 calories, 2,100 calories. And by the end of that, we were up actually at around 2,800, 2,850, roughly around those lines. And for her, as a female, she's 70, she was 73 or 73.5 roughly kilos by the time we got to the end of that particular block. She's also quite tall. She's 179 centimeters. And, got a reasonable amount of muscle on her, particularly on the lower body. So, she trains very, very hard. And so she's actually able to get that amount of food in. And her protein intake was fairly high. It was over 2 grams per kilo. Her carb intake on training days was 400 grams, and fat intake was around 55 or something along those lines. And so, our clients have also went through times where that would be very appropriate for them to do. Now, to go back to when would you look to do this, for her, it was a case of that she'd already dieted really quite heavily for particularly a year, but over the course of 2 years, she'd been dieting more often than she hadn't been. That led her to a point where she, actually ended up developing a bit of an eating disorder because she was following a strict meal plan. But the point is, if you really want to improve your physique, year upon year, or over time, generally speaking, you can't spend all your time dieting. You need to provide an environment which is a lot more optimal for building muscle tissue. And that's including if you're a female and you're wanting to really change your physique over time, really bring up like your glutes, your lats, your shoulders, whatever the goal is. Even for the guys as well, we can't afford to just be holding on to this idea that we need to be, thick skin shredded or labia lean, as Luke Lehman would say. We can't hold on to these ideals of low body fats if we're really wanting to drive muscle tissue on. So we have to get comfortable with allowing that slow progressive build up in body weight, a little bit of adiposity, so that when we do decide to drop the hammer again and strip back, we can easily do that. Because remember, it takes way longer to build muscle than it does to lose body fat. And this is why we talk about building muscle in terms of months and losing body fat in terms of weeks. And that is around about that relative scale, that kind of 4 to 5 times difference. You lose body fat a hell of a lot quicker than you gain muscle. So it's important to give that the respect and the time that it requires. So coming back to those examples, when would you do it? Well, it's always going to be, in terms of those higher calorie intakes, when you're trying to drive at a really sustained period of building muscle. Now, let's get into setting up some of the structure or framework. If we ideally look at, say you've come out of diet, I'll take Marina just at her example. So she'd spent a long period of time really prioritizing nutrient density, really kind of sticking to a set meal plan. Now, we don't want to stick to set meal plans. It is known in the research that when it comes to dieting, you don't want to actually have a high amount of food variability, because that can actually increase appetite. It can increase hunger. We want to manage that during a dieting phase. So generally speaking, you're going to keep your food choices pretty narrow or fairly rigid. However, as we start looking to increase our food, we really want to actually open up the variety of food that we're going to eat, because that's actually going to help improve our overall appetite and hunger, which is something we actually want when we're trying to build food up. And so in Marina's case, she started down at that 2-1, and it was a case of, right, we're going to remove any of the food rules. We're going to remove any of those unnecessary restrictions we had in the past. No food is off limits, but the first key point that we're going to get to is we have to keep a baseline of nutrient density. So all that means is that we need to make sure that, okay, well, what were the habits we laid down in that fat loss phase? We need to make sure that if we're having 2 or 3 main meals a day, that we're getting that, whatever we've decided is a manageable amount of micronutrition, so i.e. good quality veggies, for that client. So in Marina's case, it was 150 grams of well-cooked veggies per meal, and she was having that 2 to 3 times a day. I think I've always heard the concept of, for the amount of grams of protein you eat across the day, you should be eating at least the equivalent in vegetables. And that's a whole other topic for another time around digestion and everything else. But generally speaking, we want to make sure that nutrient density is there. And that's not something that comes out of your diet. Even when you're eating super high calorie intakes, we need to make sure that we're maintaining a baseline of nutrient density in our diet. And that's across the veggies, that's across the good quality protein sources, that's also across making sure you're getting good quality fat sources from things like, fatty meats like salmon and beef and lamb, but then also coming from places like potentially nuts, avocado, good quality oils that are not superheated. You get the idea. So we need to make sure that's coming from good sources. And then with carbohydrates, the same thing. We still want to have a certain degree of good quality carbohydrates, maybe coming from things like potatoes, rice, etc. However, I'll touch on why you might want to have things like potatoes or stuff that's incredibly satiating a little less often when you're going through a phase of building a bit more. And we'll get into that in a second. So we need to keep those baseline habits. Protein quality's got to be there. Food quality's got to be there. Veggies have got to be in there. The next thing is that if you're setting up your structure for a day, okay, we know that we have to keep that baseline of nutrient density, but we also need to make sure that we're not restricting our eating window. Now, what often we tend to see in dieting is, generally speaking, people will implement things like fasting, like, implement intermittent fasting, like a 8-hour eating window, maybe even less. They might just fast for the morning in terms of skipping their traditional first meal and then eating their second meal closer to lunchtime. The reality is, when you're trying to eat within, those larger calorie intakes, like say you're in a reasonable surplus, it's just simply not going to be achievable. At least it's not going to be advised within that 8-hour window. The reason why is that, say you've got 3,500 calories, you could definitely eat that no problem in 8 hours. But there's a couple of problems that arise from that. One, it's going to be incredibly, create an incredible burden on your digestive system. So that's the first thing, rather than spacing out those meals a little bit more, allowing the gastrointestinal, system to really kind of take its time to digest the meals, for food, the actual volume of the food to pass through, into the bowel and so on and so forth. And so that food can actually be assimilated and then excreted. The next part to that as well is if we're looking at maximizing muscle growth, we need to maximize what's known as muscle protein synthesis, which is essentially a signaling process that happens to signal that new muscle tissue needs to be laid down, or at least any damaged tissue at minimum needs to be repaired back to where it was. But of course, if the goal is to build muscle, we want to create an adaptation from both the high protein intake and our resistance training that lays down muscle tissue to be larger in terms of cross-sectional area, or it could potentially be like sarcoplasmic. Sarcoplasmic and myofibrillar hypertrophy is a whole other discussion. But generally speaking, we want our muscles to get bigger. We want them to lay down to be able to handle more force applied to it the next time that we train and be able to tolerate those force demands, which is ultimately, again, torque, and that's a whole other conversation as well. So if we keep it in super oversimplistic terms, we want our muscles to be able to respond to the stimulus we give it, and we want it to ideally come back bigger and stronger to be able to handle more torque, more force production, so that it can continue to then repeatedly become stronger and larger over time. So in order to do that, ideally we want to be signaling that MPS signal every kind of 2 to 3 hours, and you want to be doing that consistently across the day. So it seems to be from the research that 4 to 6 times in a day of spiking MPS is pretty optimal for our hypertrophy. So that would be looking like, instead of having like say 2 or 3 meals like you would in an intermittent fasting window, for example, you might be wanting to look at 4 to 6 meals across the day, more regularly feeding, and you want to make sure that those meals have a minimum protein content. I can't give exact numbers, but ultimately what we're looking for is, I would usually say that a minimum of around 35 grams of protein per meal. It might be a little less for female clients, but generally speaking, we want the leucine threshold to be reached. Leucine is that amino acid, which is kind of like the doorkeeper. We need enough leucine in our intake in order to really, really open the door as far as letting all those amino acids in to really do their thing and to really help with anabolism. So we kind of refer to leucine as like that key amino acid that helps with maximizing that MPS signaling. If we don't quite reach that leucine threshold on each meal, then just the effectiveness of our protein intake and of our resistance training potentially is going to be a little bit less. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but if you're doing both of those things right, it make a huge difference to your overall progress. So we need to get enough protein across the day, and that's very tough to do, not only across the day, but at each meal. And that's very tough to do when your eating window is very short. Again, like we said, just to summarize, we want to make sure that we can get enough total protein across the day, but we also want to make sure that we're reaching that leucine threshold at each meal as well. That's maybe something that I can do a post on or discuss another time in terms of the specific numbers around leucine threshold. And so, yes, we want to have more meals across the day, definitely not those short eating windows. And the other thing we're looking at is, if we're going to have those 4 to 6 meals a day, then we're going to be looking at generally a little less food volume per meal. So what that might look like is, say you're having during your diet, like in my case, I would usually have, like, if I'm dieting, up to about 250 grams of well-cooked veggies. I might be implementing things like white potatoes during that time, or potatoes in general, really, but white potatoes I tend to find are a bit more filling for me, at least. And because if we look at, like, for example, 100 grams of white potato versus 100 grams of, say, jasmine rice, the amount of calories are almost half. Like, there's a lot less carbohydrates in white potato than there is in rice. And so in a phase where you're trying to build up your calories, it might actually make more sense to, maybe take the potatoes out on training days in particular, but maybe just take them out in general and prioritize sources of carbohydrates, which are a little bit more calorie dense, like, say, jasmine rice or sushi rice, just an example. So these are areas where we can start to really look at, right, making sure that the volume of the meal is a little bit less. Now, that doesn't mean that the volume is low. It's just that you're not putting in voluminous foods or calorie, what we would call kind of nutrient dense, as many nutrient dense starchy carbohydrates, just because it's going to take up a lot more volume in your stomach. So we can start to look at things like that. And the last point to make, really, when it comes to the, spreading those meals out across the day, is digestion. I think I already touched on that, but it's just super important. Like, whenever it comes to taking in a lot of food, digestion really has to be at the forefront of the kind of structure and decision making. We still need to be mindful of things like, taking time to chew our food. We need to make sure that we're, masticating it right down to a pace like consistency before we swallow. And of course, when you're eating a lot of meals in a day, your food intake is just something you have to prepare yourself for mentally, is that you are going to be spending a decent chunk of your day eating. Now, obviously that's not going to be like half your day, but you're going to have to be spending probably 10 to 15 minutes, 4 to 6 times across the day to eat. So it is going to take up at least an hour of your day. And that's just an expectation that you have to manage for yourself. Now, let's get into the next part of this, like managing these higher calorie intakes. Well, we talked about nutrient density, but calorie density is your best friend when you're trying to add in calories. Now, there's many ways you can do that. There's the use of liquid calories like juices and shakes. So for example, you could really add density to protein shakes, or say you're someone who was having one protein shake a day. You might want to position a protein shake pre and post training in order to really make sure that you hit that protein intake without it creating such a big burden on your stomach. Because you can imagine that if you were to have 6 meals a day, all with animal-based protein sources, all with whole food protein sources, that's a hell of a lot of protein to chew and to eat. It just might place a bit too much of a burden on your digestive system across the day. This is where having a really good quality whey protein powder, or if you can't tolerate that, if you're having a good vegan-based protein powder like pea protein or some form of other plant protein like hemp, then that's a great place to be able to get in some easy to digest protein and calories. Now, another way you can add density to shakes is you can then start to beef them up a little bit. You can use like whole milk. You can use, add nut butters in there. You can add fruit in there. You can even add, like, if you really needed to, like carb powders and things like that. One thing I've done in the past personally is I've added ice cream and peanut butter to my shake to really bump up the calories. And that can really easily add an extra like 200 to 400 calories if you really need to get it in. So that's another thing to potentially look at as well. Another one from a completely different source of food is oils. Oils is something we try to limit during a fat loss phase, but however, during a phase where we're trying to really build in more calories, especially on, say you've got like me, you've got 100 grams of fat on your non-training days, so you've got a high amount of fats that you need to get in on non-training days, or you just get a high amount of fats that you need to get in general. This is where oils on meals or as part of meals can become super useful. And I don't necessarily mean the ones that you cook with, but more like actually sprinkling 1 or 2 tablespoons of oil on top of your meals. This can be a super easy way to bump up those fat calories as well. The next thing we're really looking at is more hyperpalatable foods as well. So we might be looking at things like breads, and that can be anything like normal, like loaf bread. That can be like bagels, wraps, like tortilla wraps, things like that. But just stuff that, again, is quite high in calories, high in carbs, but super, super easy to eat. We're looking at things like jams, spreads. So, you're looking at jams, Nutella, Lotus spread, Biscotti spread, there's all sorts of different types of spreads. You just have to be a bit mindful of, depending on your intake, if you've got like less fats to play with or more fats to play with, that, you're looking at what the composition of those spreads are, because they can vary widely. You can have spreads which are literally just sugar and carbs, and that's ideally what you want. If your carbs are high and fats are a bit lower, say on a training day, but you've got higher calories. And then on other days, it might be that actually I can afford to have a little bit more fats in my spread. So like Nutella has obviously got a lot of carbohydrates, but it's also got quite a bit of fat due to the hazelnuts as well. So it's just being mindful of the composition of those different components, but they can be super, super useful for me. I probably go through at least 2 bagels spread with about 40 grams of jam definitely on training days, and sometimes on non-training days as well, just to get the food in. And that makes it super useful. Another thing that comes in really handy, and this has become quite popular and trendy in the physique, and bodybuilding scene, is cereal, having cereal post-workout. And it could be a super easy way. You can literally get in 80 grams of cereal and get around 65 to 70 grams of carbs in one hit. You hardly even notice that going in. It's also something that's quite enjoyable and tasty. There's no need to worry about it. Like, people often get like demonized sugar, but if you understand the evidence and you actually understand the effect that sugar actually has on a healthy body, so long as it's consumed, alongside a balanced diet, you're not going to eat cereal or eat spreads or jams or bread. That stuff is not going to make you unhealthy. It's not going to make you fat. It's just, as long as it's part of a otherwise really balanced intake where you've already got your base of nutrient density, there's absolutely no reason why you can't have these things. Other things to look at outside of cereals as well is you can be looking at things like muesli or granola. You can be looking at things like oats, and maybe with the oats you've added in like nut butter, honey, or maple syrup, just to add a bit more density to it. You're also looking at maybe things like rice cakes with spreadables on it. And then, of course, there's high GI fruits. And fructose is an important form of carbohydrate, and that can be super useful for replenishing liver glycogen. And that can also be useful in the evening as well, before bed. A lot of my female clients that have had issues with sleeping before bed, and they tend to avoid carbs in their last meal. Sometimes implementing some high GI fruits as part of the last meal, like maybe a couple of hours before bed, has done wonders for their sleep quality. So this is just something also to think about as well. Last but not least, or maybe second to last, we also have intra-workout carbs that we can utilize as well. So we could easily implement anywhere between 20 to 50 grams. Now, for example, for me, I've actually got 50 grams of branched cyclic dextrin that I take intra-workout, and I've got some of my female clients that have anywhere between 20 and 30, and some of my male clients have anywhere upwards from 20 up to where I am. And that's a super easy way. Not only is it, an easy way to knock off a good chunk of your carbs for that day, but provides readily accessible fuel in the bloodstream. It doesn't, it doesn't really have to do much in the gut of the stomach, because it's already in very much liquid form. So it very, very quickly gets into the bloodstream, and you can use it, while you're training. So it's a very, very quickly accessible source of energy and carbohydrates. And then last but not least, other forms of carbs that you might look at is there's branch cyclic dextrin, which is really good. You can get that super cheap off sites like MyProtein, but you're also potentially looking at stuff like Vitargo. You can get isotonic powders like Lucozade, Isostar, Powerade. They all do carb powders and stuff as well. Probably most cost effective would be something like a branch cyclic dextrin. So that's definitely worth looking at depending on where you are in the world. And last but not least, this is a common one I often do with clients once they're away from fat loss phases and they're either in maintenance or in a building phase or an optimized phase, as we call it at the Better Body Collective. We'll often give them a non-tracked enjoyment meal each week. So we know that, give or take, if they're following their plan, if they were to go out and have a bit more of a calorie dense meal, like say they wanted to go out for like a pizza and a glass of wine, or if they wanted to go out for like say a burger and fries, something like that, we know that they can do that as long as they're kind of following the plan all around the rest of the week. Even that little bump up in energy. And actually sometimes for some people that, especially a lot of people come out of a period of dieting and they're not used to eating such a high food volume, that enjoyment meal can, one, take off a lot of the pressure around tracking on a meal at the weekend. It can allow our clients to go and enjoy social time with family and friends without that neuroticism that potentially comes from someone who's tracked for a long time, and then they feel like they have to track everything when they go out for a meal, or they feel really anxious. This just removes all of that. It allows you to be social, and it allows you to get a good chunk of calorie density in. And given that it's like literally one meal in a week, it's not going to cause a humongous issue, especially given that we're not in a fat loss phase. Given that we are trying to have calories a bit higher in this particular time frame, it's actually potentially a really good strategy to help assist that as well. Because what it's like when you go out to a lot of these places, you have a burger and fries. That's a very calorie dense meal, a lot of protein, a lot of carbs, lots of fat. And it's a very enjoyable and it's very palatable. So even though there's so many calories being consumed in those meals, it's quite easy to consume, and it doesn't usually feel the same as if you were to have the same calories from like a quote unquote clean meal. So just to summarize, guys, when would you do this? Ideally, you're someone who is either at maintenance or on a slight surplus, or you're struggling to kind of come out of your reverse diet and you need some help just getting those calories in. It's important to make sure you keep a baseline of nutrient density, larger eating window, short eating windows like intermittent fasting, ideally not be a good idea, just namely because a lot of calories to get in a short period of time. You want to ideally get, make sure that your digestion is looked after by spreading it out across the day, but also that you're meeting that leucine threshold per meal, so i.e. getting a sufficient amount of good quality protein each meal. We want to make sure you're getting less volume per meal, and you might be eating a bit more often, which is going to probably look like 4 to 6 meals a day. We want to make sure that we're prioritizing calorie density once you've met your baseline nutrient density needs. So this is where the use of liquid calories like juices, shakes can come super useful. Adding density to those shakes, like adding fruits, like frozen fruits, nut butters, stuff like that can be super useful, even ice cream. And also looking at maybe potentially adding additional oils to meals, which of course is the opposite from what we look at with fat loss, right? And then the last point would just be making sure that you're potentially including a bit more hyperpalatable foods that you weren't eating as much of before. So we're looking at things like breads, jams, spreads, oats, muesli, cereals, rice cakes, high GI fruits, stuff that's a bit more calorie dense. That's going to allow you to hit those carbohydrate targets. And those tend to be the macronutrient that we prioritize as being a bit higher when we're in a bit of a building phases. It tends to be higher carbohydrate intakes than you're used to. We can also implement intra-workout carbs in the form of things like branch cyclic dextrin and Vitargo. And of course, we can also implement an enjoyment meal each week. So I hope you guys found that podcast super useful. A very, very different perspective to what you're probably used to hearing on social media all the time, where it's all about fat loss, calorie deficits, fasting, if it fits your macros, so on and so forth. So I hope you found this episode useful. I certainly have a couple of clients who will probably find this useful at the moment, because there's some of those guys who are increasing their food intake over the coming months. Just in time for Christmas as well. How convenient is that, right? So if you find these episodes useful, guys, the best way you can support the podcast is very simply to go onto iTunes, leave us a 5-star review, leave some comments and feedback. If you're not on iTunes and you just want to leave us feedback, The best thing you can then do is if you're listening on something like Stitcher, Spotify, you can easily then just take a screenshot of your phone and you can post that on your Instagram stories, tag at Better Body Collective and hashtag at Better Body Radio. That is by far the best way that you can support us, guys. Spread the word, share with those that you know who would find this type of information useful. And for those that are regular listeners of the podcast, again, we're very grateful to you guys. We're hoping to get this type of information out in front of as many people as we possibly can. And we really appreciate your support in doing so. Have a great week, guys. And until next time.